pivot a little bit and talk about how Django helps you do all those things that we just got done talking about doing. So if you look at this picture, you see that like forms are kind of in the middle of this picture. That's the final piece we're filling in. And forms are connected a lot of ways. Forms can be connected to models. They're used in the view and they're used in templates. And so they're a very powerful part. And all the things that we've been doing as abstractions, where we write a little bit of code and find lots of ways to reuse that code. Or we write some code that extends an object and then we add a little bit to it, and then we've got some very powerful object when we're all said and done. And so that's what we're doing here in forms. And forms can be used in views, they can be used in templates, and they can interact even with models. And so we're going to talk a lot about forms. There's a lot of like just menial labor that just working in forms, and if you really had to build all the HTML from scratch like I did in some of those earlier examples, it's just really painful. And there's other problems too, and that is that there's just a lot of repeating yourself. We kind of want to use like object-oriented techniques and other techniques to not repeat ourselves. And it's really easy to put the HTML for a crappy form, but why wouldn't you want a beautiful form? And so if you write the HTML and you write some CSS and you do a kind of crappy version of it, then you have to fix it or hand it to a designer, and then they have to go fix 100 pages. There are things in Django, Crispy Forms is something we'll talk about later, that just like says, hey, I'm using forms in Django. Wait a sec, I want them to be pretty now. And then you just make them pretty. And if you want to change how they're pretty, you can change how that works. And then you change them all at the same time. And so not repeating yourself, being able to like lean on utility code. Seems like, why would we do this? But in complex applications, you just fall in love with this idea that you don't have to repeat yourself. And even though I've showed you some of the things like post, redirect, refresh, CSRF, all that stuff, it's even more complex than that, especially when you start talking about pulling data from the database and putting it in an edit form and then checking to see if the data is valid. If the data is not valid, send back an error form and give them a chance to resubmit it. If they're successful, you do post redirect and then you send a message in the session. We've done all that in really simple, but if you really look at everything that you need to look at, it's pretty complex. And so we're not going to do all this in this first lecture, but this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that a create form, where you're going to go like, new cat, and then you got some forms to fill out, fields to fill out about the cat, and then you hit the save. And so if we just go through this, these are the steps you need to do to insert a cat in your cat database, right? So your browser initially goes and gets a GET request, and then you fill out the empty form with a bunch of fill-in-the-blank fields. The user can always cancel out of that and get out. The user might enter some data and hit post. Now the problem is, what if you have some rules about the data, such as this is required, that has to be at least 5 characters, etc. You have to then send a form back with that data to let them fix it and resubmit it again. Or if it's good, you go ahead and store the data in the database, but then we have to put some kind of a success message, like in a session or something, and then send a redirect out, and then the browser immediately comes back and gets the redirect URL, which pulls the message out, sends the page, and sends the success. And so we've done parts of this already, right? We've done parts of this already. The big part we haven't done is kind of like this middle part here, where we're like validating the data and have this error retry loop that we put the user back in the loop and give them another chance. Now that's the create form. The edit process, where you're pulling in an existing cat and you're going to edit their fields, is even more complex. You go load up a cat, but you might have an error page because they're looking for a cat that didn't exist in our database. You send out the form with the old data, they might leave, they might edit it, they might come back, they might validate the data and get an error, then they have to fix the data. They got to go around here until, okay, we got some valid data, and then you store the data in the database, put a message in a session, send out a redirect to a success URL, and that success URL, you put out the message and say yay. So that's complex too, and we're going to figure that out. Delete is not as simple as you might seem. The problem with deleting things is that you can't delete with a GET request. So usually you have to go navigate, like you see a little delete button, you click on it and you go to a delete page. It's going to load the data that you want to delete so you can build a confirmation page. Confirmation pages turn out to be really important because they're also our tricky way to convert a GET to a POST. But if they're asking for the wrong data, we have to send an error message. Otherwise, we send a confirmation form that says, are you sure you want to delete this? That's both nice for the user to give a confirmation, but it also then turns this into a form. And of course, they can leave with a cancel, but if they click on yes, that turns into a POST, and it has the key. So the first thing it does is it has to load the data again from the model. And then if that data is not there, they got the wrong key, then you send an error page out. And if you got the right key and the user has permission to delete the data, then you go talk to the model and you delete the thing, right? Then you put a congratulations on your deletion in a session or something. Then go with a redirect because you can't respond with a 200. You got to respond with a 302. And then the browser immediately does a get a success URL, pulls the message out of session, makes a success page with the message. Now we're going to cover this a bunch of times, so you don't have to get this the first time. But I just am telling you that forms are complex. And what's cool is Django form objects that we're going to create act like glue. They can generate the HTML, they allow for a consistent look and feel, and they allow for you to change the look and feel. When the post data comes back from the browser in a form that it created, then it puts it all in the right spot. It validates the data based on a set of rules that you say, like this has to be this kind of a thing and that kind of a thing, or a date or a character or an integer or a floating point. Whatever it is the rules are, that's all done for you in Django. And if something goes wrong, then it hands you an error form that you can send right back to the user. It really greatly, and then of course, once it's validated, it moves it into a model and then actually can even do the database store automatically. So the form is like this glue thing that sort of talks to templates, it talks to browsers, it reads data from browsers, it plugs stuff in. And so in a way, the form is like the controller, it's like the view, it just makes your views really succinct, and you're gonna love it once you understand it. So here is a simple form, and so forms live in a file called forms.py, not surprisingly. And basically, just like them, it looks a lot like the models file. And so you're going to see the one thing that forms do differently is they can have these things called validators. Models have rules about max length, etc. But there are even more complex validators, and you can even write code that you have your own functions that when the form is coming in, you're going to look at this one field and you're going to say like, oh, I wanted 2 uppercase characters followed by 3 lowercase characters. Sorry, you didn't do what I said. That's what's called a validator. And that's when that error page goes back and it says, hey, you're missing this stuff. And we'll show you how the validator stuff works. But basically, you put in little lines just like you did for the model. And you're effectively defining a user interface plus a bunch of logic behind it. Now, the one thing I'm not doing in this particular section, we'll do soon, is connecting this to a model. So you could say, wait a sec, I'd like to make a form and I really mostly want to inherit from a model. You can do that, but that's not this one. That's coming up in the whole next section, but it won't be long. So the form object, right? So here's this form we just made. It's got 3 fields in it. And this is a real simple view. It's not useful. It just kind of shows you one of the things you can do. So make a basic form. When the basic form is defined as having these 3 fields, and then you say form and then call the method as table. And so what this produces, it's just a dump. There's nothing, the UI of this looks really ugly. But basically it generates all this HTML for you, all this HTML, input tags, and we told it to do it as table. That's not necessarily the prettiest way to do it, but all that HTML is generated from the form utility. So it can send it out as a list, you can send it out as paragraphs, etc., etc., etc. And so this is just to show you kind of the dump. If you go to this URL, do a view source on it so you see this stuff in here. So that you define a form object, and one of the things you can do is make me HTML. And this is not a good example. We'll come up in a bit with a better example. The better example, of course, is to use it in a template. And so here is a template with a simple form in it. We got a form, it's a post. We got some submit stuff. We got ourselves a cancel, button that we put in, and we got a CSRF token, and we're going to use that form as table, and we're going to surround it by a table tag so that it looks a lot prettier. And so this is a far more typical way of doing it. That first one was just to dump it. And so this, when you do this and you give it, you sort of make the form in a get request. You make the form and you pass it into the context. If you remember, form.asTable, that's a very, come back. Too far. Form.asTable came from the context, came from the passed in variable, and that is right here and right here. And so we make the form object, which has all the fields in it, and then we pass it into our view, our template, and it renders that. And so then this is what it looks like, much prettier. And if you do a view source of that, if you go to this form create and you do a view source on that, you'll see it's all that same table stuff. You know, it's the same table stuff that we had before. It's just now wrapped in some stuff to make it look a little prettier. We put a submit button, it's got a form tag, and then you can actually hit the submit button and something actually happens. So this is by far the more typical way of using a form in a template. So I talked about the create form, the update form, and the delete form. This is kind of an example of how forms can be used. Now, I'm not actually talking to the model yet. We'll do that in a bit. So I'm just going to pretend that we have some old data. And so this normally would come from the model. This old data, title, mileage, purchase date, that would come from the model normally. But for now, we're just going to like make it up. And so then you basically start a form and you pass this old data in as the constructor. That's a constructor for a basic form. From the basic form class, pass in old data and give me back the form. Give me back an object of type basic form, and I'm going to have it in the variable form, and then I'm going to pass it into context. Now you'll notice I'm using the exact same template, the one I showed you before, because that form as table understands that sometimes there's data in these fields, and it properly puts the data in. It properly escapes the data. It understands that this is a number. It understands that this is a date. It's got all that stuff all figured out, right? And so this is how it works, is you just somehow get your hands on key value pairs of the old data, you pass it into the constructor, and now you render the form, and the forms library takes care of putting in all that old data. Believe you me, you're probably glad I'm not showing you how to do, HTML and code and all these things, and when you do code, but this is a little different because it's inside of an attribute. You don't want to know that because you just are going to use form as table, and it's got all the rules figured out. This is hundreds of lines of code that you're not writing.
Hello and welcome to another Django for Everybody walkthrough. So you are probably at this point working on your autos assignment. This is our first real create, read, update, and delete assignment. And we're going to, a lot of what this assignment is to look at the code I've given you in DJ Free Samples and pull it in. Do not clone the repository for this assignment. The DJ Free Samples is a monster. It's got all kinds of stuff in it that's way too complex. And you do not want, you want to start with a nice clean application. Your previous assignment was to make a really tiny application. Now we're going to extend that application. And that's why you've already have this DJ for E projects in your, wherever it is, okay? And so what this is this assignment is to evolve that using the sample code. But what I'm really going to do is I'm going to walk through the sample code because there's new concepts in this sample code. So this is more of a lecture about the sample code than exactly how to do the assignment. But importantly, you need to understand every single line because literally every program that we're going to write for the next N weeks is a variation on this CRUD, right? And so these views, these default views, the get or 404, all that stuff are really foundational things. And what we're going to find is the right way to write this code, like everything in Django, is really small and succinct. Okay? So let's take a look at the code. Let's go ahead and run the code. Go to autos, and you got to log in. And so the idea of this is there are two tables. There is a table of makes. So I'm going to add a make, and then I'm going to add an auto. And the cool thing about this is neon 1, mileage 1, 2, 3, 4, Sakai car, and then I have this cool drop down. And so this is there's a whole bunch of forms going on here. There's drop downs. There's a many-to-one relationship going on. Then I have this list, and I can update it and delete it. So that's where our full CRUD is. And so we can add makes, view makes, add autos, etc. And so that's all the samples. So it's very close to what it is that you have to write. It's just don't go grabbing all that stuff. So let's start by taking a look. So I'm here sitting in my DJ free samples. And if you look, you see all of my various applications under a project. And so we've got the autos, but I really want to start with the authentication code. The code that, if I go here, back to samples, let me log out, the code that allows me to log in. So if I go straight to autos, see if I've logged out. Right, so you'll notice that what it does when I go straight to autos is it routes me to login and then with the next to go back to autos. So this view in autos, the /autos, has protected itself with login mixin. And later we'll do login. Your login won't quite look like this, but this is the one I have on samples where you don't have to make it pretty yet. An upcoming assignment is going to make everything pretty. So now we're at autos and we're logged in. Okay, and your application has to have some more things here, but I'm more interested in showing you really the essence of the views in this autos, right? So if we let's just review just briefly. Let's just review briefly about how the auto login works, right? So if I look at DJ free samples /settings.py, you need to have this auth plugged in, right? So that basically that's a bunch of code, some views, etc. that comes from Django, and that's been there all along when you did your start project. Of course, then somewhere in here we've got to have the autos, wherever autos is. Yeah, autos app config. You get to pull the autos app in. And if I take a look at DJ free samples /urls.py, then I can find autos here. And there needs to be some kind of a link that basically says at the top level, everything below autos is delegated to the URLs file in autos.py. But also then there is the accounts, right? And so if you recall, this is a bunch of views that comes from Django for us. It's pre-installed for us. And the thing that we've got to do is we've got to build we've got to provide this a template with the name registration.html. So I think I've got this in home/templates registration. Yes, I do. So I've got actually two logins. I've got a really simple one is login.html, and this is the one I recommend that you start with. Later we'll use the social login. And this is very simple. It's a login page. It uses the Django Forms capability. If form.errors, that means that there was a validation error and it came back and redisplayed this page and showed you an error. And then we make a simple post form with a URL that is a reverse lookup to a view with the name of login. Then we put the CSRF token in, and then we take the form, and I'm just making this with paragraph tags. And so that's a simple login. That's not the actual one that we're showing. And then the next is a hidden value that you've got to pass in so that when you actually successfully log in, it knows to come back to autos when it's all done. It comes back here after the login has been done. And so that registration/login, you can put this in any of your applications, but you want to name it registration/login.html. So if I take a look real quick and I go into home templates, these are all the templates. When I do an ls, you'll see that I have a home templates home and a home templates registration. You can have more than one folder here. And if I do look at what's in registration, you see that I've got this simple login and then later the more complex login that will give us the GitHub login capabilities. So we can log in using, what that means is login use social. The point is underneath this templates, you don't have to just have one subfolder. You can have more than one subfolders. And so that is the necessary configuration to make it so that when we tell our views to add the login mixin, which we'll see in just a second, when we tell our views in the login to use the login mixin, then it knows where to get the template from. So that's just part of it. And your instructions tell you how to do that. So any application that you're going to build or any project you're going to build, you have to put those in settings.py, urls.py, and then make the template. And then you have to start using login mixin, and then everything just magically starts coming together. So let's take a look at the actual autos application. We'll look at a couple of different things here. Autos slash URLs. And I'm going to do a I'm going to tab so I can switch back between files really fast. You probably have a better text editor than me. So I've got URLs. I'm going to take a look at the views. Nope. Autos. Views.py. Then I'm going to look at autos model.py. Models.py. And then I'm going to look at autos forms.py. And so let's sort of work through these 4 files: URLs, views, models, forms. Probably let's do models first. So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to make a make object class. It's going to have one character field with some validators in it. We kind of played with that with forms. You can put validators in models. We've previously seen validators in form, but there's a validator that basically says we're not going to accept data coming into this database table unless there's at least 2 characters. These __str, you've been doing this for a while. That basically is if you take a model object, an actual make, and you print it, it says which of the fields, in this case there's only one field, and so that just says when we're converting a model to a string, a model object to a string, we get to decide how that looks. Okay, and then we have an automobile, and it's got a nickname with a min-length validator, max length of 200, a mileage, which is an integer field, a comments, which is a 300-character field, and then a foreign key into, this is a one-to-many or many-to-one relationship, not a many-to-many, just a foreign key into make, and then we're going to do on-delete cascade, which really means if you delete a make, then the corresponding auto entries will automatically be deleted. And so this is a pretty straightforward model, actually very, very simple. And once again, we're always defining this __self so that we know that we're just, if you're just showing it like in the admin interface, or if you're just printing it, or just converting the model itself to a string, the field among these fields that is supposed to be used is the nickname field, just to show to end users. So that's the models file. Let's look at the forms file next. So the forms file is interesting because we've seen forms that are just forms by themselves, but this is a special kind of form in that it's a model form. In that we normally, in the other models, we had all these fields, right? And we put them in, and it looked a lot like a model file where we'd have a character field, a positive integer field. But what we're basically saying is, you know what? We're going to make a form here. And really, all we want to do is take all the fields from the make model and make them form fields. So a form and a model are 2 different things. A form is something that goes between sort of the view and the template. And as you'll see, it also goes down into the models automatically, but you gotta, so this is just like make all the fields, right? Let's make a form, because form objects don't have to be associated with models, but in this case, we are going to sort of derive a form object from a model. And so instead of extending form, we're extending model form. So that's a model form must have, and this is just some data that says the model that we're going to pull all our fields from is the make model. And it only has one thing, which is a name. That's it. Okay, so this is auto-generating a form that if we changed it and added another field here, then this make form would automatically have a field. You can give it a list of fields, __all__ is like a signal to say, just give me all of them. Now there might be some internal things like created at or updated at or something that you don't want to use. So that's a form. Remember how forms work. Covered that before. Let's take a look at our URLs. Now, a lot of this looks pretty similar to things that we've done, right? We basically have a main table, which is our autos table, and our lookup table, which is our makes table. And we have sort of 3 things. There is the main list view, which is list all the autos. there is the main, the make list view, which is list all the makes. And then we can make a new one, which doesn't have a primary key, because part of the idea is the create is making a new thing, which is going to generate a primary key. And then we're going to have a update and a delete. And so we have a read, a create, update, delete. So it's not exactly CRUD, but you see all four of these things. And so we've got views, and we name these views so that we can reference them in our views themselves and in our templates, so we can make links in between them. Okay? Okay, so these are pretty straightforward and not all that different. So the fun starts to happen when we're in the views.py. So login mixin, if you remember from the auth-z walkthrough, you just add this to a view, and it just basically says you cannot get to this view unless you're logged in, and if you aren't logged in, it will bounce to the login.html file and then bounce back after you're done. And so login required mixin is all we need to do. If you go with the auth-z sample, you'll see like I did that by hand, but you don't want to do it by hand. You just call login mixin. Now, so this main view is a list view, and so let's go take a look at what this is going to look like. This is the list view. So we're going to take however many autos we have, we're going to loop through that list, we're going to retrieve all the autos from the database, then we're going to have an add the auto link, then a view the makes link with a count of how many makes there are, and add a make. So let me also then go into autos templates, autos again, yeah, I'm sorry about that, and auto list. So this is the template that makes that. And so there's a few things that we get. We get an auto list. Now the names of these are not forced upon you, but there's conventions that turn out in a moment. They're going to look really useful, okay? So we're going to get an auto list, and if we go back into our views, we see that we say get all of the objects from the auto table, all the auto class objects, retrieve them all, pass them in to the context as auto_list. Now we also want to be able to show that little count, this number 2. So we're going to ask, go ahead to the make objects all, but don't give me a list of them, count them and give me a number. So make count is stuck in there, and you'll see if make count is greater than 0, we can show the add an auto button, and it also somewhere, yeah, shows the make count, view all the makes, add a make, and the make count comes out here. So that's another thing we put in. The auto list, we're going to go through, and that iteration variable of auto is going to go through each of the separate things, and nickname, make, etc. That's right straight out of the models.py file. There's the 4 things that every auto has, and we're just printing all this stuff out. You also get the primary key, and so we're going to make a update URL, and that URL is to autos auto update. So if we look in urls.py, we see this auto update looks up this, gives us a path to the view, but that particular path needs one parameter, which is a primary key, and so that means that this URL template tag autos has to have the auto ID. But because we're looping through the models, you got one, right? So, and you do an auto create, that's pretty straightforward. But one of the rules is you have to have at least one make before you can do an auto, because if you recall, add an auto has to have this drop-down list populatable, and that's being pulled from the make table, okay? And so that's basically the way around this. That's the main view. Now, just like I showed you before, it turns out that there are here we go. Auto create update. Yeah, that's the autos view. So, and then if we do the make view, we're doing the same kind of thing. If we go and look at the make list, we're doing the same basic kind of thing. View all the makes. This is the, and now we got update and delete. this way you don't need a count. We just want to grab all of the objects. We want to put it in a context under make list, and then we do make list under HTML, and this is even simpler. It's just going through the make list. It comes in through the context. If there's none, we don't print this out, and then we put out the name of it, and then we have an update and a delete button that goes to the update and delete. And of course, those, if you look in urls.py, those also, the update and delete, have primary key requirements. And so you have a primary key that you got to pass in here to make that URL the proper kind of URL. And then just some links to go back to the various things so that we can, get back to autos, view makes, add a new make, cancel, all that stuff. Okay? So that is the views.py for listing the autos and the makes. Okay? Now, we want to make the make create view. Okay? So if we take a look at the make create view, that is add a make. That's going to create this form. I can make this bigger here. Create this form where you're going to put in a thing called Chevy, BY. So we need a way to make this form, right? And so we're going to make it a login required. We're not going to let folks do this. We're going to have some variables that are class wide, like what template we want to use. And success URL is after we have done this right. Now, if you just submit it and it complains, it doesn't do it. But once you've done it right, where do you want to go afterwards? So Chevy. Where do you want to go afterwards? This is a controller function. Boom. I want to go back to the auto list. And so the success URL is go to autos:all, which in urls.py is this main view. That's the name of the main view. Okay? And so if we go here, which template to use and which success URL. If we do a get request, we're going to build a form for the make. That comes from make form, but really it comes from the make model, which is just one string field. It's simple as that, right? We're reusing this. We're just saying let's make a form that pulls from here. We have to pass a form in because models can't be used to create this kind of a screen. That screen comes from a form, okay? And so if we take a look at the template, oops. If we look at the make create template, make form. So that is, that's the template we're going to use, the make form. We're going to need form as table, right? So that's from how we did forms. Put the CSRF token, you make a table, that could be as paragraphs or as tables, but whatever, you need this form object. So you need to pass the form object in. And so here we are. We're going to make a form, and then we're going to pass the form object in, and then we're going to render it self.template, autos.makeForm, HTML. And then we're going to return that for the get. And then when we hit the button, the submit button, add a make, we hit the submit button, it's going to do, it's coming into the post because we made a form post, comes in. We're going to take the, oop, don't do that. Oh, that's terrible. I hate it when VI does that. But here we go, we're back. Yeah. So, post comes in, request.post has all the key value pairs, which are these key value pairs as defined by the form. So we say, let's make a make form with the initial data coming in from request post. And given that the form generated it, it knows what the names of these fields are, and this is something that hides behind how forms work. But it also checks to see if the form data is valid. And that means, were all these validator rules followed? If the validator rules are not followed, if not form is valid, we're just going to send it back. And so so this code here, this if form is not valid code, if I put in a single letter, A and hit submit, it's going to come back and re-render the form, and all that error stuff, all that stuff is all handled by this form code. This Django form code figures out what is wrong. Right, let me move this over just a little bit so I can get back to it faster. There we go. It figures out what's wrong with it, makes an error message. The error message came from models.py right here. Oh no, right here. And then went through forms.py, because it is a form ultimately that we inherited from model form. Get it? And so that's cool. So that's the error condition. And otherwise we do form.save. Now the thing here is that's really super cool is because this form is a model form. It knows this, and the field names are the same as the field names in the model, and so it actually does a save on the model itself. So in a way, the form contains the model data that came from the post request, and then it saves it. Okay? That saves the form. It puts it in, and then we just redirect back to the request URL. So this is pretty succinct, right? We pull in the post data. We check to see if it's bad. If it's bad, we send it back, send the form back to the exact same template we did, and then we save it if it's good, and then we pop to the success URL. That is a beautiful thing. But just like in Django all the time, this is a far wordier thing to do, even though this is super succinct. And if you did this in almost any other language, you'd be like, 75 lines of code. And here we have like 15 lines of code. But it turns out in Django, there's almost always a more succinct way to do it. We have a generic create view. You can take a look at the documentation for this generic create view. Django views generic edit. Let's just go and Google this stuff. I always just put a dot here, and this usually gets me right to, because that's the actual package and the class inside the package. Oh no, sorry. It thought that was a domain name, so the search didn't work. But now I'll just say, Django something. Look like, so at least it's going to do the search for me. Generic editing views jump to the create view. So you can read through all this stuff, right? Generic create view. Actually, let's make a, do I have a reference to this? So there you go. Take a look at that. Now, this, just like some of the other views that we've inherited, have a ton of functionality in them. So if I want to do an auto create, this is all it takes. Now, auto create and make create, for all intents and purposes, do the exact same thing. So what happens in auto create, because we're extending create view, we have 3 bits of metadata. We tell it which model we want to use, which fields from that model we want, and where the success URL to go is. And then this generates all this code. We inherited all that code. You'll notice that there's nothing hard-coded in here except the make form. Now, we don't even have to make a form for the auto, because this code right here builds the form. And not only that, but it uses this name auto to pick the template. So if I do auto underscore form, I have to use this, right? I use this, that's my base bootstrap. Don't worry too much about that. And so it knows the name of the template that it's going to use. I don't even have to tell it which template to use in here, because it derives the template. Auto underscore form.html is the template. Pretty cool, huh? Pretty awesome and cool. So it automatically finds that and the success URL. And so this is all that's needed. As a matter of fact, I could, in this make create, I could have deleted all this code from here to here, but instead just do a create view by extending create view. So I'm just showing you this because I want you to see what's really going on. But this is not how you write your code. This is how you write your code. Okay? So now I want to show you the hard way of doing an update. So what's an update? Let's take a look at the code. So let's take a look at view makes. Update is the thing that happens when we go here, and that's going to go to make update. So here's make update. Here's urls.py. It's this one. Lookup primary key update, which then if you look under here, it's going to be autos lookup one update, right? So I'm going to update the Chevy one. It has to read the old data, has to show it to you, and then let us update it, and then submit it, checking, of course, for any validation errors, and then redirecting us back to a success URL. So if we look at the views, we're going to, again, foreshadowing, there's a much easier way to do this. So we set these variables, where the success URL, which template we want, and the model, okay? And then we have a GET request, and because in the urls.py, there's this int pk, we're passed in this pk value. Now, this get object or 404 is really cool, okay? So self.model, this get object 404, self.model pk equals pk. That's this parameter, but we're passing pk equals, and it's common that they're the same name, but this is a parameter to get object or 404. The second one is the parameter that was called to our get. Self.model, of course, is make, right? And get object or 404 basically checks to see if, so I'll do this update. Let's go to makes. Let's do an update. And what it's doing is it's taking this number, this 3 here, autos lookup 3 update, and it's retrieving the old data. Now, what happens if I inadvertently have a number that doesn't exist in the database, like 9,999, and I do a GET request to that one, I get page not found 404, right? And so what's happening here is somehow you say, hey, load this object and give it to me in the variable make, or just blow up and send out a 404 error, right? And so this is telling you what's going on, which view you just know make matches the given query. Now, generally, you're not supposed to hand type these. 3 works, and so it doesn't blow up. So get object or 404 is a way of loading the old data and then protecting, and using that data, or just blowing up. So don't go any farther at that point. Now, then we're going to make a form, and we're going to fill it with the old data. So the instance is make. So that's the object. Make a make form. Here's a make form. All the fields from the model inherit from the model make. And then pass it into the template make form.html, which we just looked at. This form comes in. That's all we need. This is very generic looking. It really doesn't care too much. It's all pretty much encoded in this form, which is derived from the model. Then, of course, we type a bunch of stuff in, blah, 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 and we hit submit, and it does exactly the same thing as the create, in that it does, well, first it has to do a get or 404, because we post to the thing with the primary key. We load it up to make sure we have an object to update. Then we create a new make form from that database and then change it. So this is the starting data, but then it alters it to the data. So in this particular case, Chevrolet is the old value in the database, and if I say bow tie, request post will have bow tie. This will start as Chevrolet, but in this form object, then it will be bow tie. Of course, if it's not valid, we're going to return an error message right back here. And if it is valid, we're going to save it. And so this new bow tie is going to be saved in there. And so if we view our makes, we see that it's now bow tie, right? And we're going to redirect to success URL. Now, at this point, I would hope you could predict about what's going to happen next. Auto update extends update view, the generic editing view. It says which model it is, which fields you want, and where to go when it's successful. Okay? And then it does everything that's in here, right? It does everything that's in here. And literally I could go and say the exact same words for make delete, which is what happens when you go in here and you delete, and then you have a cancel. There's a there is a confirm delete, and the name of this template is not randomly chosen. It's got to be called the confirm delete, the model confirm delete, right? And there you go. You got a CSRF token. You're handed the make as an object in this, so that produces this output. There's no form in this one. There's just the make that gets loaded by object or 404, and then it passes make in and renders it, and then when the post happens, it retrieves it. If it's there with a 404, again checking for bad data and deleting it, and then hopping off to the success URL. And it doesn't take much to guess what I'm going to do next, and that is if you extend delete view, you get all that code for free. You just tell which model, fields, and where to go for success. And so the key thing is as you're doing your homework, I'm sure some of you are just going to like copy and paste all this stuff. That's wrong. This make create, the make update, and the make delete should be as short as auto create, auto update, and auto delete, because you're going to do this a lot, right? You're going to do these generic editing views a lot, and we're going to do CRUD over and over and over again, and you really do not want to write 15 lines of code. That's unnecessary repetition, unnecessary cutting and pasting and changing code, if you can keep it really simple. So I can basically build a full set of CRUD forms and CRUD functionality with validation for a model with this kind of code. And then I don't even have to have a forms.py, I just have a models.py. So if you're doing your autos, you kind of would think I made a mistake if I'm making a forms.py, because if I just use this views.py this way, instead of making all of them look like make update, then you're going to save yourself a lot of time and energy. And when you have to modify these things, it's a lot easier to find all the changes and then modify them. So that is a walkthrough of the sample code for autos. And you're going to do an assignment on this, but don't just copy everything. I set this up so that the time you spend understanding what's going on, particularly in the views, right? URLs you'll probably just copy. Models you just copy. The URLs you'll just copy. But the views, don't just copy it. Figure out what's really going on and come up with the easier and more succinct way to do all this stuff, okay? Because Django is starting to look really beautiful at this point. So I hope you found this helpful. Cheers.
So now we're going to talk about data validation. Data validation is what happens when you hit the submit button and then that data is sent to the server. And what the server does is it checks that post data that it's getting to see if it's proper according to its rules. So if you go back to this picture I showed you in the create form, the part we're talking about now is really this part right here, where the user has entered their data, they've hit the submit button, and we in the server are going to look at that data. And then we are going to decide if it's an error, send back a form, or store the data, and we're actually sort of just have a comment say store the data, and then go to the success. So we're really looking at this part right here of receiving and validating the data and then taking all those actions, okay? So the idea of data errors is you're typing in a form and you forget your zip code, and you hit the button and a little red box pops up and says zip code is required. Now you can also tell the fields in the browser that they're required so that the browser won't even send the data. That's different, and not all browsers do that. So you still have to check if you really want the zip code. You got to check to make sure the zip code is there. Now in this one, I made it just to generate errors. I made a validator on that form, if you recall, that said that all the titles have to be at least 2 characters. And here's a little message: please enter 2 or more characters if that's not true. Because otherwise, you know, the fact that it's not a string or a number or whatever, because the browser is a little too smart for us. So I had to come up with a validator that would fail in the server and not fail in the browser. You still need to validate data in the server. So you type some stuff in, you make a mistake, like in this case, the title was only 1 letter. I hit the submit button, and now what I want to see is a thing that tells me what the errors are and gives me a chance to fix it, including putting the old data that I just posted, right? So it gives me my post data back. And then I get a chance to resubmit. So again, here's the data form, and the validator there it's a min-length validator. If you go look at the documentation, there's a jillion validators. This was really simple, and it fits on a slide. So basically, in addition to whatever the fact that it's got to be a character field, I want it to be at least 2 characters. And that's not a crazy validator to have, because you know, you might have a post that says, look, you're not going to have a title of 1 character when you're doing a blog post or something like that, right? You might say, look, at least 5 characters. So now we're going to walk through that process. And so if you take a look at this code from the form, in comes a GET request, and that GET request is going to show up with some old data. It's going to create the form with the initial settings. It's going to build a context that it's going to pass into the render. Same render form that just makes the thing with the table tags and CSRF and form post. And so at this point, we are a GET request. We are returning a 200, which is returning the HTML for that page, right? So that's the first part of it. And that is in the edit process, get the old data, show it to the user, and give the user an opportunity to change the data. So now we change the data, right? And let's just, you know, say we didn't make any mistakes. You changed a few numbers, you hit the post, which gathers up all this stuff and sends it as a post request to the server. So then what happens is it comes into the post method. See how these class-based views are so dang pretty, right? So pretty. And so request post, right? All that data coming from the form comes into request post, and you just construct the basic form and say, hey, basic form, your old data is from the post, and all the fields are named the right way, and the key value pairs. I mean, this is basically a dictionary, but the form made the key value pairs. It knew what names to name all the forms, so it named them, and so it's not surprising. It knows exactly what to expect in there, right? And so it takes a look at the post data, and then it constructs us a form object, right? It constructs us a form object and basically says, if there was a validation failure, if not form is valid, then we're going to do one thing. But in this case, I didn't make any changes, so form is valid, so it drops down. This is where we would normally store the data off to the model, but I'm keeping this really simple. And then I'm going to redirect with a 302 to form success. The other thing I might do is put a message in the session so that the message makes it into here, but I'm keeping it simple. And the browser immediately comes back and does a get to /form/success, and then I return thank you very much. I might have pulled a message out, as we've seen in an example, where I have, from the post method to the next get, I drop a flash message into something, but there's better ways to do that, and I'll show you that in an upcoming lecture series. And so that's the success flow, and it works great. Now, let's take a look at what goes wrong. So in this case, I got my form, I put in the wrong kind of title, it's too short, I send a post, it gathers up all this data, sends it along with the post, that comes in request.post. And so now, the form comes back, and now form is valid as false, because I violated a rule. Now the interesting thing is, in this form object is not only the old data, but also all the error messages, because at this moment it has constructed a form object, and part of the form object is error messages. Okay? So if it's not valid, let's make a little context. Okay? Let's make a little context and pass that in, and then out it comes, and at that point, that form as table is going to print out all of this stuff. All those error messages come back. So I render it back. Now, I render it back, and then of course you can submit it and maybe get to a success. Now there is one sort of interesting question about this page, which I have asked a Stack Overflow question about, and I'm not sure I'm ecstatically happy about it, and that is, this pattern is exactly how Django wants you to write it. It wants you to write this. And if you'll notice, I'm doing something I told you not to do. Django is telling me to do something that I don't want to do, and that is return a 200 at the result of a post. So I got a post. Now the key thing is, the thing that everyone will agree on is, once you store data, you have to return a redirect. And so the Django people who've done this for years, they consider it okay to return the 200 and a page after a post if no data was changed. Now the problem is, if you hit refresh on this, you're going to get the weird funky message. But this is how Django works. And so I don't know what to tell you. I can write my forms differently. It's a few more lines of code in here, and I've written that, and I've made it so that I pass the error message and I serialize the form and put it in the session and do something. But I'm not going to fight City Hall on that one. I'm just going to say, if Django thinks it's fine, the thing we do agree on is, if you're going to return a 200, don't return a 200 after you've saved data, because then you'll double save the data. Like, you'll double commit a transaction, you'll double do a transfer, you'll double order, you'll do whatever. But in this case, all we did is looked at the data, came back, and then sent back an error message. So you can look at the Stack Overflow where I sort of argue for a little bit. So this has been a long lecture series. We talked about HTML, we talked about HTTP, how get and post are different ways of doing it. We've talked about the idea of how to fix the refresh.